Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We had a bit of a technical issue behind the scenes, but thank you very much for joining us. I'm Virginia Stewart-Taylor, and I'm a committee member of the Exeter Alumnae Group Committee, and I'm going to host this evening's event, which I'm really excited about, so I hope you are as well. But before I introduce our guest speaker, I'm going to speak a little bit about who we are as a group. So the event is organised by Exe-X, which is the University of Exeter's alumnae group. That's not alumni, it's alumnae, so it's for female graduates, and we organise a mix of networking, careers, education and training events. And we think we might be one of the only groups in the world of our kind, because several years ago we noticed that there was a need to support and bring together specifically our female alumnae. We have two groups. I'm on the committee of the London-based group, although we're now more of a national and even international group, as most of our events are online, so they can be attended anywhere. And there's also a Southwest branch based in Exeter who occasionally do in-person events when restrictions allow. And our London or national group has a LinkedIn page, and the Southwest group has a Facebook page, so do get in touch with us there. And we've got recordings from previous webinars you can access as well. That's it from me. Over to our tonight's speaker, who I'll just introduce quickly. So Catherine Bishop is the author of a book called Make Your Map, Career Success Strategy for Women. I've been really lucky to hear Catherine speak before, and I came away so inspired. So I'm really excited for you to get that same experience as well. But beyond her book, she has numerous other accolades. She is an Associate Fellow at Said Business School at the University of Oxford. And she works with leaders from all over the world, and particularly women. Her other roles include being chairman of Britain's newest tax authority, established in Wales in 2018. And she was also awarded a CBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours earlier this year in June 2021 for services to diversity and public administration. And she's worked with many, many women over the last decade on how to design their working lives. And she's poured everything into her new book and also this presentation for us. So before we do that, she's going to spend around 25 minutes on her presentation, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. So please do submit your questions throughout her presentation. You don't have to wait until the end. And just to flag, we're not doing breakout groups, which was mentioned in the advert. We're going straight into the Q&A, so get thinking on those questions. So thank you very much, and over to Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you for the welcome. I'm delighted to be here. And my task in the next 20-25 minutes is to say something interesting and I hope useful on the subject of women's working lives. It's particularly appropriate to talk about this topic right now with headlines like the Great Resignation, the Great Attrition, a recent report by McKinsey, and a sense, and I'm quoting, a sense that people are hoping to leave behind pandemic restrictions and their jobs too. But actually, of course, this topic has always been worth talking about. And as I share my first slide, I hope that it will become apparent why I say that. So there we go. I'm hoping you can see that. So do you remember what it is you wanted to be when you grew up? The ambition you had when you were much younger? I think at that stage of our lives, for many of us, it looked kind of like this. I know what I want to be, I'm pretty focused, and I'm going to get there in a straight line. But of course, actually, for almost all of us, what it looks like is something much more like this. The goal turns out to be different, and the route for getting there is blown by many winds. And in fact, when you ask all sorts of women in all sorts of different sectors and organisational roles to tell the story of their working lives so far, the same sort of picture emerges. But along with that, in research terms, you also hear three particular themes that emerge when women tell the story of their working lives. And this is taken from a substantial piece of research which the Business School at Oxford has done, talking to female CEOs about their careers. When they tell those stories, they talk about self-acceptance, they talk about self-development, and they talk about self-management. And I'm just going to explore very briefly the research insights that emerge as a kind of foundation for what I'm going to go on to talk about. So this idea of self-acceptance, the moment, if you like, in your working life when you accept and limit and acknowledge that this is what you have, and indicate that you're willing to take the trade-offs that might be necessary as a consequence. Research talks about processes by which, and actually all of us, come to recognise and accept their own, and as a consequence to cope with expectations, overcoming confidence barriers. And that moment of self-acceptance occurs at different times in your life. Interestingly, there is some research that suggests that the moment of self-acceptance for many men, not all men, but many men, occurs rather earlier in their lives, perhaps when they're 11 or 12 and they're appointed team captain of one of their sports teams. By contrast, for many women, that moment can sometimes occur much later in their 20s, either at work or because of a family responsibility. I don't need to say much about the second theme of self-development. You're all here investing your free time in this webinar. But the theme here acknowledges the fact that women need to be proactive, to choose what it is they're going to develop, when and how, rather than waiting for the end of year performance appraisal at work and for someone to suggest perhaps that you need to go on a course again to overcome that persistent limitation. This is about proactive ownership of your own development, recognizing that it's key to your definition of success, whatever that may be, CEO, corner office, or work that is meaningful and makes a contribution to the community in which you live and work. And then this notion of self-management, something that women talk about occurring throughout their working lives on a micro level, the day-by-day planning for meetings and for negotiations, but also on the macro level, a recurring theme that sets out about how you want to remain authentic, remain true to yourself, but also try to get stuff done in the real world, and having, as a consequence, to manage the contradictions that may present. The research acknowledges probably what almost all of us feel to be instinctively true: finding a balance can be very challenging. So I've been thinking about these themes and about the many different aspects of women's lives over the last decade. And here's the proposition which I've been working on, developing, testing, and want to talk about in the rest of my presentation. The idea here is that the challenge for all of us at work, men and women, is to navigate through rapidly changing job markets, to use our resources and skills to best effect. And that, of course, is exactly what organisations do when they use organisational strategy to plot their direction. So that's the proposition here, that we as individuals can use the same approaches which organisations use for planning and development on ourselves, on our own working lives. And what I'm going to do in the course of the rest of this presentation, what I've done in the book and what I've done in a lot of my teaching, is just explore how that might work. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of it. And as I do so, if you have questions, things you'd like to know more about, please do post them. It will be good to have a chance to respond to them later. So when organisations talk about organisational strategy, they typically talk about three phases, three stages. The first phase looking at where you are now, as is. The second stage looking at where you want to get to, if you like, the to be state. And then the third and most important set of activities looking at how you're actually going to get there. Implementation, the journey of change, if you will. And you can think of these three elements using this simple triangular graphic. And it's a very good way of gluing it into our minds. The notion of resources, the stuff that we've learned and have now, the notion of purpose, setting out where we're trying to get to, and something about the external opportunities that we might want to find or seize or even create. One of the things that this triangle is particularly good for is reminding us that strategy has an internal aspect where organisations think about what they themselves have under their own control. That's true for us too. And an external aspect where organisations do market research or look at new or emergent opportunities that might arise for them. And that also is true for us. But of course, what you have to do in strategy, it's one of the reasons why it's worth getting good at strategy, is to make sure that the triangle stays aligned. Why do I say that? Because if you are devoted to a purpose for which there are literally no opportunities, you are going to spend your life searching rather than contributing. If you are keen to take up opportunities for which you have insufficient resources or not the right skills, then plotting that part of your course is not likely to be successful. So the challenge for all of us is to keep those three aspects, internal and external, kind of aligned, and to do that regularly as the external over the time. Now that's pretty easy, but it can be quite hard to decide what that actually means. And so in addition to this one strategy model, I've identified 8 others that are of some use to individuals, both men and women, in finding their own direction, in achieving success, whatever they choose to define that to be. And I've grouped this slide around those 3 original stages. Where are you now? What have you got to work with? Where do you want to be? Where are you headed? And how are you going to get there? And in fact, the trajectory through the book and through this slide runs from present and indeed past, looking at how you got to where you are now, through the enticing but difficult question of where do you want to be, to the all-important question of, okay, so how precisely are you going to get there? What are you going to do? The book covers all 9 of these models, and in particular, since it's entitled Make Your Own Map, one of the exercises is literally about making a map of how you got to where you are now. But the one I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of this presentation is a model that organisations use to help them with transitions, and which we as individuals can also use to help us with transitions. And I've picked this to talk about right now because of all those headlines. 40% of us, apparently, so a Microsoft survey says, are thinking about changing our jobs in the next 12 months. So if you're one of those 40%, or if you even think you might be, let's take a look at one of these strategy models, just one of the 9 that I've looked at. And it's this one. It's called the Ansoff Matrix. And organisations use it to help to work out how to move their product range into new markets. And we can use it too if we repurpose, if we adapt this model very slightly to think about our existing resources as if they were a product, our own skills as if they were the product that we have to offer or to sell, and the market is the employer or client that we work for. And this model suggests that there are a collection of different routes to make a change in your working life if you want to. You can develop much further, become more senior, have a larger scope in the organisation where you currently are, expanding your role, if you like, using your existing skills. You could develop some new skills within the context of your existing organisation. You could use your existing skills in a new market, transferring to a new organisation in the same role that you're in at the moment. Or of course you could make a complete change, changing both skills and organisation, diversifying completely into a completely new kind of working life. Those different routes bring with them different levels of risk. Some are easier to do at different times of your life and in different market conditions. Lest this sound horribly theoretical, let me just give you some examples of people who've taken one or other of these routes. And here's the first of them. This is Kate Bingham, who was formerly chair of the UK government's vaccine task force, pretty universally acknowledged so far to have been a success. She took her existing skills from her existing market. She was a biochemist by training and spent a lot of time working with venture capital funds, really accustomed to risk. She took her existing skills, risk assessment, her biochemical knowledge, and moved it into the public sector when she took on the role of being head of the vaccine task force. So existing skills, moving into a new market, moving into a new context, moving into a new employer, if you like. Now, here's a different example. Andrew Cotter, sports commentator, during the pandemic with absolutely no sports event. So took his existing commentary and made some YouTube videos commentating on the behaviour of his two dogs, Olive and Mabel, as if they were sportsmen. So again, using existing skills to inject, and subsequently then writing a couple of books about his experience in doing this. So now developing some new skills, as you can see from the arrows there. Here's a third example. A colleague of mine at Oxford whose new skills in online development made her absolutely the go-to person to talk to. Absolutely everybody suddenly wanted to talk to her, to borrow her expertise, to get her involved in their projects when the pandemic lockdown constraints began. And so she suddenly found that she was in the same role, same employer, same paycheck, but suddenly she developed some new skills that made her a key contact for all of us. And then finally, the highly risky strategy of making a major career change in a single bound. Now, this is risky for organisations. Brand new product, brand new market. Are you sure it's going to work? And actually, it can also be very risky for individuals. Not always, but sometimes. Possibly the best example I can find of this is a faintly humorous one. And it comes from a fairly old Monty Python sketch. In this sketch, somebody who wants career counselling has come in to see John Cleese, who is the career counsellor. And John Cleese says to him, the good news is we've had your psychometric profile results back, and we've identified that you would be absolutely perfect for the job of being an accountant. And the counsellee is horrified. He says, no, I'm already an accountant. I absolutely don't want to do that now. No, I want to do something completely different. I want to be a lion tamer, and I want to start tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I've come to you to help me get a job as a lion tamer. That's what I want. It transpires in the rest of the sketch that he doesn't really know what a lion is. Indeed, this is his idea of a lion. This is an anteater, small and cuddly, with many fewer teeth. It's a ridiculous story, but it illustrates this point about the difficulty of moving from an existing product set and an existing market in a single bound to a completely new role. Now, of course, he could, if he really wanted to, make a series of interim steps to get himself there. He could, for example, take on a job as an accountant for a circus. He could do evening classes. He could clean the lion's cage out at night. And then maybe if he built a reasonably good relationship with the existing lion tamer, he might be allowed to help as an assistant. You can see the point I'm making, that this Ansoff Matrix, adapted for individuals, sets out some interim steps that we might want to take, even if what we really want is to make a big career change, to reduce the risk of doing so. Now, I couldn't leave that story behind without telling you that there was actually an example of someone who did precisely this. The Daily Mail reported some years after the sketch was first broadcast that someone who used to be a barrister threw up his legal career completely and took on a role as a lion tamer. History doesn't report whether it was very successful, but I'm sure he was happy having achieved an ambition in the first few months of so doing. So what I've tried to do in that very brief presentation is just give you an example of the way in which a particular organizational strategy model that organizations use to try to navigate through a market that changes very rapidly can also be repurposed for us as individuals. It's just one example, and there are 9 others in the course of the book, helping you literally make a map to find success, however you choose to define it. I'm going to stop there after that relatively brief presentation. Plenty of time for questions and comments and discussion if there are any. I do hope that's been useful. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Virginia, let me hand back to you and hope that we have some questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. Just a reminder, if you haven't already posted a question, please do while we've got Catherine's attention this evening. It's a great opportunity to put any questions to her. I'm going to start with a question, which is a broad one. So what is one piece of advice you've been given during your career that you've found most helpful? I know that you've spoken before about how the book came out of your own career deliberations yourself. So what advice have you found helpful?
I'm going to cheat a bit and give you 2 answers to that. The first one was for me the light bulb moment when the idea for this decades worth of work appeared to me. I was working in a lecture theatre at the business school with a colleague of mine who teaches strategy. We were working with the board of a global organisation, helping them think about market possibilities. And at one point he just turned to them and said, by the way, do you have a strategy for you? Because if you don't, you should. And that was the light bulb moment for me. I thought that was a great bit of advice. Always try to have a strategy, which of course, for us, as well as for organisations, needs to be refreshed regularly. Markets change, job markets change, and our lives alter too. But the piece of advice that I have found most helpful, I think, comes back to this notion of being aware of what you are best at, what you really want to contribute and have the opportunity to make a difference to the people you work with or the world. And here's the piece of advice. Only do what only you can do. And that's really a piece of advice about prioritization. Pick those things that you are uniquely qualified, that you are best placed, that you are most to do those things that other people really need from you. Now, of course, prioritization is very difficult. I've not always been able to live up to it, because sometimes you just have to do stuff that people ask you to do. But I've always tried to live up to that. And as a mantra, I found it very useful.
Great, thank you. On a related note about to what you just mentioned, one of the three things that you need to identify in the presentation is the where do you want to go. For some of the alumni at our university just starting out, often it's quite difficult to pinpoint what that might be, and it can be quite difficult to take a decision about which route to go down. Do you have any advice for anyone who's experiencing that?
I think the first thing I would say is that women's lives in particular go through phases, and that sense of direction may shift. The slide I showed you right at the beginning with the ship being blown all over the map is the reality for many of us. So don't be afraid to articulate a direction that might be for the next 3 to 5 years, and then revisit it. That's a normal part of organisational strategy, and it's a normal part of our strategy too. I think the second thing to say is don't be afraid to experiment, to try something out. Maybe a small experiment, joining a different network, asking someone if you could shadow them for a day, investing your time in a short development course in an area that you are interested in but have no current skills in. Some of those experiments can be enormously productive. Don't be afraid to explore some opportunities. And sometimes it's worth taking a step into the unknown, but do so with a clear-eyed view of what you are really good at, what you love doing, and what, in your view, your bit of the world really needs from you. And just holding those things in your mind can be helpful in choosing which opportunities to pursue and which ones to turn down, maybe temporarily, but to turn down.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, so another question we have. So do you have any advice for a woman working in a very male-heavy industry in terms of getting your voice heard and being respected? I would love to know this, as I started my career in tech and did not find it the most gender-balanced industry. So, Catherine, it'd be great to hear your advice.
Well, I think I've got two things that I have to say that I hope might be useful. One is about the idea of having your own personal board, and the second one is about what's called the strategy of amplification, which comes from staffers who worked with Barack Obama's government. So the idea of having your own board is obviously a parallel to this idea of having effectively an organisational strategy for yourself. And the idea is that build yourself a small group who can support you and challenge you and extend you. Maybe somebody who works in the same field as you, but not necessarily in the same organisation. Somebody who's really good at coaching. Somebody who might be a mentor from the organisation or from somewhere else. Someone who knows you really well, for example, and use them as a sounding board to help you think through those difficult moments that we all face when you're trying to influence, to get your voice heard, to get a negotiation done. You can serve the same purpose for them, of course, so it's a mutual relationship, but this notion of having a board to support you, made up of people inside or outside the organisation, can be interesting. And the second thing is the strategy of amplification. If there are other women within your organisation, Obama's staffers were finding exactly the same situation, that some of their female staff members were just not able to get their ideas heard. And so they made a deal with each other that in meetings, if, say, a particular woman raised a suggestion that was just then brushed over, somebody else a few sentences later would say, actually, can we go back to what Mary said? I thought that was a really excellent idea. And a third woman would say, yes, I did too. Just actually collaboratively amplifying the voices of particular women, and again doing it mutually in a supportive way. Let me offer those two ideas and hope that one or other of those might be helpful.
Thank you very much. We've got a few more questions that have a very specific kind of female angle to it, so I'm going to ask them next. The first one is on your opinion on the gender pay gap and how much maternity leave contributes to this. How can we overcome it?
So I worry a great deal about the gender pay gap for a whole collection of reasons. Much of it can be structural. Because I am focused on development work, what I'm also interested in is the importance of women being able to develop negotiation skills and influencing skills to work in these different contexts. There's a whole collection of development activity in both these areas, negotiation and influencing. And I think it can be helpful for us to acknowledge that it's not always easy. There's plenty of research that says women can be very good at negotiating for their teams or for other people, but are not always good enough at negotiating for themselves. And so as individuals, we may not be helping what I acknowledge is often a systemic problem. On the subject of maternity leave, one of the interesting insights that came out of the research that I quoted right at the beginning of this presentation was talking to those female CEOs in that particular research sample about their own experiences of having a family. And what was interesting, surprising, and if you like a bit encouraging, was that many of them commented along these lines. Your working life is very long and goes through many phases. The phase of wanting to or having to take responsibilities that fall in your direction from outside work, children, elderly parents, community responsibilities, whatever they may be, is only a phase, and that phase passes. And I think thinking of one's working life in that way can actually be very helpful. Strategies are often set by organisations. In the next 5 years, we'll concentrate on this particular market. And in my life, I found it helpful to set priorities for a period, 3 to 5 years, where if there is, I once said to myself, if there is a clash of meetings and my child needs something from me, for the next 3 years, I will prioritise my child and I will take the consequences. I will accept the consequences. And then at the end of that 3 years, I'll review that strategy. And if it changes, then we will need to renegotiate and have a blunter conversation. Everybody's experiences is different, but I hope perhaps that might be of some use.
Thank you. I think you might have also answered the next question we had on a similar topic, which was around how a child can fit well into a strategy of a career. So maybe I'll slightly, because you've already answered that, I might just slightly spin that a little bit to ask about how I've noticed that a lot of women can sometimes kind of, when they go back to work, try and pivot to a slightly different field of work. That is, so, you know, tweaking their product or their market in using your terminology. Do you have any advice to women who are doing this kind of for a specific phase in their life, perhaps around family planning?
Yep. Well, let me re-emphasize the phase point. Strategies should be time-stamped. Even your own personal sense of purpose, if you can uncover it, probably has a timestamp too. It's not going to change radically, but it will have a timestamp. So that's one of the reasons why women in particular, this family responsibility and childbearing issue, it's one of the reasons why women, I think, need to be really good at strategizing for themselves. And tweaking your product or your market when you go back to work can be a way of creating the space for you to redesign a working life that works better for you at this stage. It's not the only way of doing it, and in fact, often if you're able to go back to the organisation where you were before you went on maternity leave, you typically have some social capital which you can expend in the negotiation that you might want to initiate about working differently, about different working hours. And of course, those conversations are now, frankly, much easier post-pandemic than they were before the pandemic. I wonder how long this useful fluidity will last. I think there's a window of opportunity for us to do some negotiating and tweaking the way in which we work. And I fear that it's possible that the window might close, so seize the moment.
I hadn't really thought too far in the future, actually, so that's interesting to hear you think the window might not stay open, because I think in some senses the pandemic has brought a lot of positives for women in terms of flexible working. I've got another couple of questions about setbacks and knockbacks. How do you approach setbacks when you have put a strategy in place and something kind of throws you off course? Yeah, there's a particularly nice analogy there about the winds changing, perhaps, as the boat crosses the Atlantic. How do you make sure you're still on track and get back on the right direction?
Well, I think the first thing to say is everybody experiences the winds blowing them off track. It's a universal thing. So if it happens to you, try not to worry too much about it. Secondly, sometimes when the winds blow you off track, there is a new opportunity. So it's also worth keeping your eyes open rather than focusing exclusively on getting back to where you were. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, one of the reasons, the first exercise I typically get people to do in devising their own strategies is literally to draw a journey map of their working life so far, with all the high points and all the setbacks. Because it can be very useful to remind ourselves what we've already encountered, what we've already coped with, and frankly, what we've learnt from it. When you do this exercise, you can see literally in the map in front of you that you've drawn that you have coped with setbacks and come out of them, and often flourished to a much greater extent as a result, because of something you've learnt, or the confidence that you've gained by thinking, all right, that was pretty difficult, but I've coped, I'm still employed, I'm still upright. So that can be a very useful exercise. As I say, it's one right at the beginning of the book, your journey map.
Okay, thank you. We'll all be adding the book to our Christmas wish lists.
Thank you. Nice of you.
I've got a few more questions, specifically about diversification, and I was interested about this as well because I know that there's a stereotype of women being slightly more averse to risk, and you mentioned diversification is the more risky option of the four. So one question is that from one audience member is, from looking at that model, it appears that I have to take two paths, one being diversification, but the risk is too high, so I have to also use existing skills within what I do to change my work. However, do you have any advice to diversify with lower risk? And this person specifically wants to move from private practice to being in a creative career. And then a second question I'll come to afterwards. I'll let you answer that one first. Okay.
So I think there are two things that might be of some use here. The first of them is the notion of job crafting, and the second of them is the notion of a little bit of parallel running if you've got the energy. So let's take them in that order. So job crafting is the notion that actually we all have more power, more agency than we think we do to tweak our existing jobs to become involved in a project that moves us into a slightly different area, even if it's just part-time involvement, to sign up for a voluntary activity that the organisation is supporting in a completely different field that might allow the opportunity to meet new people. So there's a little bit of kind of crafting and tweaking that you can sometimes do in some jobs that might give you some tangible experience of the kind of work you want to move to. And the parallel running strategy is really looking for a voluntary opportunity to run alongside your paid work. It's not always possible at different phases of your life. You've got more than enough to do, but sometimes there are phases where you think, I really, really do want to move into this industry sector, or from the private sector to the public sector, or I want to become a non-executive, or I want to build a portfolio, or whatever it might be. And taking on something as a voluntary activity with a small amount of your time can both teach you what it's like and give you some insight into the skills required, and confirm or otherwise whether that is really what you want to do. So that reduces the risk, if you like, although I grant you it does increase the time and energy you need to devote to it.
Yes, I can empathise with that. It's yeah, needing to find the time and the energy, I think, is the key point there. But if you do have a flexible organisation that lets you, in some cases, you know, some people can take a day off a week or a day off a fortnight to explore something else first before taking that leap. Yeah, that's really great advice. So another question on diversification is from one audience member is, do you think that the current job market and the pandemic has made it easier for diversification?
Oh, that's a great question. I've really noticed that there are two kinds of narratives running in the press about the post-pandemic job market, which are not quite there yet. One of them is, oh, fluidity, flexibility. We can think differently about when and where we choose to work. It's going to be very hard for organisations to say that that's impossible. And maybe that's true, and I hope it's true. Certainly a good number of our assumptions have been overturned. The other set of narratives, though, indicate that, firstly, women in particular have, in some cases, found the experience of the pandemic particularly exhausting, as the burden of responsibilities outside work has fallen unevenly on them. There's a Deloitte report that cites the fact that some 70% of women who feel that the pandemic has affected them negatively fear that this negative effect will persist. So when you think about these two narratives, I think it's important that we don't necessarily subscribe joyfully to one or negatively to the other, because it isn't yet clear what's going to happen. But I think it's worth continuing to pay attention to that, because there is fluidity at the moment and you might want to seize it. But organisations, you have to ask the question, in 3 years' time, will organisations still be saying, yeah, fine, you and your team decide which days you want to come in on, when they are faced with the difficulties of maintaining their organisational culture, of bringing in people who are new to the organisation, particularly people for whom this is their first job, of ensuring that there is sufficient space for collaboration and innovation. I just wonder how long this window is going to stay open. I really hope it's going to stay open for a very long time, and we can really make some progress after the setbacks that the pandemic has indeed, I think, given women in equal opportunity terms. But I think it's something we all have to pay attention to and watch out for.
Thank you very much. One of our attendees has said in the chat, thank you, that really is helpful. Oh,
good, that's the most important thing.
So we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so if anyone does have a few more questions, please do add them into the Q&A bar. I do have another question, which is about it relates to having the courage again to kind of take a risk, and particularly when you say kind of when people are branching out into new skills which they might not have, and they need to kind of invest in the product development phase. I think that was the one that you mentioned. when it comes to that, some women especially feel a lot of imposter syndrome, especially if they can't see women of their backgrounds in similar positions. So coming back to the kind of male-dominated industry, what is your experience of imposter syndrome? Was that a factor in the book? Is there anything specific in terms of the exercises or the strategies that you recommend to help women conquer that?
So there are many conversations that we have about imposter syndrome. Interestingly, of course, we need to remember that although women may talk about it, men also feel it. They just deal with it differently. There is some research that says around 40% of the working population experience some form of imposter syndrome, but our reactions to it perhaps differ. The first thing to say is that the journey map exercise that I spoke of can be very useful to remind you of how much you've already achieved, how much you've already coped with, just how far you've already come, even if you felt throughout you were carrying the burden of imposter syndrome. The second thing is to try to reframe it. I've spent a lot of time trying to do this for myself, and that is to reframe imposter syndrome as rocket fuel, as the thing that is going to make you prepare really well and carefully for every meeting and interaction. The thing that's going to make sure that you've read the papers, even if a good portion of those also attending the meeting have not. The thing that makes you careful and attentive to what people are saying. The thing that continues to make you open to the possibility that somebody might have a better idea, or that your own idea might need to be changed. And in that sense, imposter syndrome is a gift. It is the thing that prevents us from being closed-minded, bullishly pursuing a particular agenda that may no longer be successful. So that's, I guess, my message. Use it as rocket fuel, put your arms around it, love it, embrace it. Many of us feel it. You're not the only one.
Thank you. Okay, so one final question, and then we'll finish up for this evening, which is to say that you've been hugely successful in your career. I mean, the latest accolade of your CDE is hugely impressive, and you're a fantastic role model. So I was going to ask you, how do you currently use your techniques in your life and to reach success? So, for example, kind of how often do you refresh your strategy? Is it something you're thinking about kind of constantly? Is it something you review? You mentioned earlier, kind of once every 3 years. How do you use that currently, especially when we're in such a changing situation with the job market as you mentioned?
So I do think about my strategy. One of the things I think about quite a lot is this notion of my own personal purpose, which is incredibly useful if you can uncover it, but is not easy to articulate. And I use the word uncover because you really are trying to extrapolate from what's already inside you, from the things that you love doing. I've found over my life that my sense of purpose has shifted, not radically, but become slightly different. And sometimes that's because a new opportunity has presented itself. In 2017, somebody telephoned me and said, would you like to apply for the job of being chairman of a tax authority? And I was astonished. I said, I'm sorry, I think you must have the wrong number. I don't know anything about tax. And they said, no, it's a job to create a brand new organisation, and why don't you apply? And I thought, how extraordinary. All right, fair enough, I'll give it a go. Who knows? And actually, of course, I got so interested in the process. This little tiny experiment of putting an application in became more and more interesting. And as a consequence, I started to realise, hang on a sec, I really think my sense of purpose is really beginning to shift now. It's now much more about putting into practice those things that I teach. let's really move into a phase of my life when I can see whether that's my driving mantra. So sometimes life gives you the little weak signals that says, hang on a sec, I think it's probably time, you might want to do something different. Sometimes that can be a signal of boredom. I'm a bit, if you're a bit bored with what you're doing right now. Sometimes it's an external signal, as we are experiencing at the moment. Here are a whole range of different opportunities to work for different organisations in different locations. Would you like to explore any of them? When you do that, though, when you feel a sense of shift in your purpose or your direction, go back to the strategy triangle and make sure that you have or can easily develop the resources you're going to need to serve that purpose, to capitalise on that opportunity, to rise to that challenge. Keep that triangle in balance as things externally change around you.
Very wise advice to finish on. Thank you so much, Catherine. We're going to wrap it up there, but thanks to everyone who attended and for posing your questions. I hope you've enjoyed this evening's event as much as I have. So do look out for future events from our alumni group, either the London/national group or the Southwest group as well. And as I mentioned before, you can find us on LinkedIn and Facebook. But yes, a huge thank you to Catherine for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And it was lovely to hear you speak again.
Thank you. It was really lovely to be with you all. I hope it's been helpful.